welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds, and this week we're continuing the discussion on balanced soil fertility and what that means and looking at why I struggle to build my potassium levels. If this is something you've thought looking at soil tests and fertilizing for a long time, you want to pay attention to this one. So the first place I want to start though is the importance of potassium. Potassium is one of the main three macronutrients that we think about because it literally does everything in the plant. I think of potassium as I think of worker bees in a beehive. Those worker bees are always doing something. You always see them and they're always having some role. So potassium handles water regulation and drought tolerance. It helps with winter hardiness and root growth. It helps with stalk strength for sure at the end of the season, all season long. It's involved in protein synthesis, and just every part of the plant really needs some of that potassium. So when you're short and low on potassium, you're going to see it show up in a big way. Not only stature of the plant, yield of the plant, everything is going to suffer. So before we get into the two big points I have, I just want to point out, if you're looking at a soil test, to understand what you're looking at. When you see that potassium column on a soil test, that's your exchangeable potassium. And what they mean by that essentially is they're measuring that part of the soil, the potassium in the soil, that's exchangeable. So we have potassium in soil solution, think of it in water, that's available to the plant now, immediately. And then we have exchangeable below that. So as the potassium in the water goes away or is taken up by the plant, that exchangeable replenishes it. So that's what's there, easily put back into there to supply your crop for that season. So why do we struggle to build potassium levels? So the first one I'm going to point out is location, location, location. And what I mean by this is really your soil type as it relates to pH and cation exchange capacity. So thinking about those two things, if we look at pH, a lot of us in Latham country have high pH. And high pH makes it a challenge to build those potassium levels because usually those cation exchange sites, although you may have a high CEC, 20 to 30 CEC, there's a lot of room to hold on to cations. But the problem is most of those exchange sites are taken up by calcium and magnesium. Those have a 2+ charge. So those are kind of the big mean brothers that push potassium off of that exchange site. Unfortunately, potassium is only a 1+ charge compared to calcium and magnesium that have a 2+. So potassium is lower on the pecking order or the totem pole. It can't fight those two off. So if you're looking at soil tests and you see a base saturation percentage on calcium of 80-90%, that potassium is probably only 1% or less or somewhere around there because it just can't beat out those two on the exchange sites. So that's number one. Number two is really looking at the clay type in your soils. Clay type is important. As research has come out in the last many years, they've been looking at this, especially up in North Dakota and northern Minnesota. The shrink swell capability of your soil really plays a big role in how tightly potassium is held. So essentially, if you have a high shrink swell clays in your soils, you need to have that potassium level a little higher. And why that is, I grabbed one of my books off the shelf here on soybeans. If you think about those clay layers as the pages in the book, you can see as they fan out, when they have moisture in them, it's all right. And that potassium can be exchanged and moved back and forth between those layers. But when it dries out, especially like the last few years, those layers tighten up. And unfortunately, they hold that potassium really tight. Until they get moisture, they're not going to release it. So it's essentially unavailable potassium in between those layers. So shrink swell capability of the clays does play a big role in not only how much potassium your plants can take up, but the level at which you need to be seeing potassium in your soil. It needs to be higher in those high shrink swell clay soils. So some of the things we should do and not do. First of all, if you have manure available, that's one of the easiest ways to build outside of what I'm talking about. With the microbes and everything in it, you're going to be able to the silver bullet, I guess, or the silver lining of all this, you're going to be able to jump right past all these issues with manure. You can build your K levels using manure. The other thing is, don't apply more than 200 pounds of K2O. Potassium is a salt. Potassium chloride especially is a salt. You don't want to put that ahead of a growing crop in terms of germination and early growth. It's going to really hamper that. So make sure you're not overdoing it in the spring with potassium fertilizers to try and build them if you're seeing low levels. The last thing is, if you do have low levels and you want them to be higher, but you just can't seem to get them to build it, make sure you're feeding that crop. So fertilize every year, not every 2 years, especially between soybeans and corn. Soybeans, a 60 bushel soybean crop is going to require over 70 pounds of potassium that season. So make sure you're applying that. If that's potassium chloride, you're going to be putting about 120 pounds down roughly just for that crop, and then do it again before corn. So just make sure that you're feeding that crop. So there's a lot of things to talk about when it comes to potassium and why it's so important, but I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at 1-800-GO-LATHAM or visit us on our website, lathamseeds.com. Thanks again for watching this week's Ask the Agronomist.